He told her the walk-in cooler had died mid-service, and he was stuck behind the line until close, scrubbing salvaged inventory and apologizing to a dining room full of people he could not see. He said it in that low, unhurried voice that had charmed food critics and talk show hosts and a wife who had believed it for 9 years, the voice of a man who had never once been caught. He said it from 40 feet away, from the same terminal she was standing in. His hand was resting flat against the spine of a woman in a yellow linen dress, guiding her toward the first-class check-in, like he'd done it 100 times, because he had. Maren Sinclair stood at the mezzanine railing above the departures hall and looked down at the back of her husband's head. She knew that haircut. She knew that jacket, the slate blue one she'd had tailored for him the winter his show got picked up for a second season. She knew the easy roll of his shoulders, the way he laughed with his whole upper body, the way he was laughing now at something the woman in yellow had said. Behind them stood his mother in a cream travel set, sunglasses already on indoors, holding a fan of boarding passes like a winning poker hand. Beside her, his sister, phone lifted, herding 2 small children in matching striped shirts toward a luggage cart. The whole family was leaving. All of them, for somewhere warm, somewhere with a beach, somewhere that required first-class seats and a woman in a yellow dress. And the only person missing from the picture was the one who had spent nearly a decade keeping every one of them upright. She did not gasp. She did not call out. She stood very still, the way she had trained herself to stand still in 100 rooms, over 100 years of being a Sinclair, and she watched, and a part of her that had been asleep for a long time slowly opened its eyes. Maren Sinclair had been born into the kind of money that does not photograph well, because it never had to. Her great-grandfather, Edmund Sinclair, had turned a regional shipping concern into one of the largest privately held logistics and real estate holdings on the Gulf Coast. Her father had taken that and folded it into ports, warehouses, and a quiet sprawl of commercial property from Houston to Charleston. By the time Maren was old enough to understand what a trust was, the Sinclair holdings cleared $500 million, and her own line of it, managed since her christening by a firm of lawyers who had buried 2 generations of her family, threw off enough income each year to fund a small city and never feel it. Nobody knew. That was the architecture of her whole life. She had watched what the money did to people. She'd watched her aunt's marriage rot from the inside when it turned out the husband had married a number, not a woman. She'd watched cousins disappear into yachts and rehab. She'd watched her own first real boyfriend, at 19, go quiet and strange the day he found out, and she'd felt the exact moment his affection curdled into calculation. By the time she was 25, Maren had made herself a promise that sounded naive even to her own ears. She would find out whether a person could love her for nothing. For just her. She would strip away the name and the number and the gravity they exerted on everyone who came near, and she would stand in the open as a woman with an ordinary salary and an ordinary apartment, and see who chose her. So she moved to Charlotte, where the Sinclair name meant nothing, and she took a job coordinating events for a hospitality group. A job that paid $61,000 a year, which she lived on with the discipline of someone who had genuinely never needed to. She drove a 6-year-old Honda. She clipped coupons, not because she had to, but because the habit kept the disguise stitched tight. She let people believe she budgeted because she had no choice. And she watched how they treated a woman they thought had nothing. She met Julian Voss at a restaurant opening she'd been hired to run. He was the chef, not famous yet, just hungry, just charming, just 29 and burning to be somebody. He had flour on his forearm and a grin that arrived before he did. He talked about himself with the fluency of a man who'd found no subject more compelling. And ordinarily that would have ended it for her right there. But late in the night, when a busser dropped a full tray and the room went quiet and cruel, Julian crossed the floor and crouched down and helped the kid pick up shattered glass with his bare hands. And he said something that made the busser laugh instead of cry. And when he walked Maren to her car at 2 in the morning, he asked her a real question about herself, and then, this was the thing. He listened to the answer. He didn't perform listening. He listened. That was what undid her. She had spent her entire life being heard by people who were actually doing arithmetic. And here was a man with flour on his arm, who had no idea who she was and simply wanted to know. She watched him for a year before she let herself believe it. She paid attention to how he spoke to people who couldn't do anything for him. She filed away the small things, the way he could turn cold when a review went sideways, the way a compliment landed in him like a coin in a slot. The night he forgot her birthday entirely, and then was so wounded by her disappointment that somehow she ended up comforting him. She saw those things. She told herself they were the rough edges of an ambitious man. She chose, against the better instincts she'd inherited from a family that never chose anything against instinct, to believe. They married when she was 30. She planned the wedding. He showed up and was photographed. She noticed that too, and put it away in the part of her mind where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at. The first years followed a pattern she recognized with the clean, cold clarity of a woman raised to read a ledger. She ran everything. He ran nothing. His career took off the show, the second restaurant, the third, the cookbook, the brand. And to the outside world, Julian Voss was a man of obvious success, a man with valet parking and a media team. What the outside world didn't know, and what Marin came to understand in the blue light of her laptop at 2 in the morning, was that none of it actually made money. Restaurants devour cash. His grew faster than his margins, and the gap got papered over with loans and lines of credit, and a lifestyle that performed wealth the way a stage set performs a mansion. He spent like a rich man because he was supposed to be one. He was, in plain accounting, broke and gorgeous and sinking, and he had no idea because the woman he'd married kept quietly bailing the boat. Not with the trust. She never touched the trust. That was the test. The daily decade-long test of whether the man she'd chosen would ever once look up and ask how the boat stayed afloat. She covered shortfalls out of her own salary and her own savings, and when the holes got too big, out of a personal account funded by a sliver of trust income she told no one about. She managed the mortgage on the house, the insurance, the taxes, the tuition, the staff schedules at his restaurants when his managers quit, the vendor disputes, the health inspector who needed soothing, the investor who needed flattering. She remembered the names of his sous chefs' wives. She sent the condolence flowers when his line cook's father died. She built the machine he stood inside and waved from, and she did it so well that he came to experience it as weather, as something that simply happened around him, like sunshine, requiring no maker. She documented all of it, not because she planned to leave. Out of blood. The Sinclairs documented the way other people breathed. Her father had never made a handshake he didn't memorialize on paper, so she kept records. Every shortfall she'd covered, every system she ran, every bill that bore only her name, not as a weapon, but because she was Edmund Sinclair's great-granddaughter, and a Sinclair never made a move without a file. When Hazel was born in their 4th year, Marin took 8 weeks and came back to a house and a business still running flawlessly. When Theo arrived 2 years after that, she discovered on her return that Julian had not, in her absence, learned the name of their children's pediatrician. He loved the kids. He genuinely did. He was warm with them, goofy, present at bedtime when he was home. But the load of them, the invisible freight of 2 small lives, he never once picked up. He held the parts that felt like love. She carried the parts that were work, and the world called him a devoted father and called her, when it noticed her at all, tense. His mother made an art of not noticing her. Glenda Voss was the kind of woman who could open a wound with a compliment and have her hands clean before you felt the cut. She visited every few weeks and arrived with a list of preferences she expected to find anticipated. The right brand of decaf, the Guess soaps from the boutique she'd mentioned admiring once, the throw blanket in the color she liked. Marin provided all of it invisibly, and Glenda received it like the natural order of things. "You do keep a clean house, Marin," she'd say, in the tone of a woman conceding a single point in a much larger argument. "I always say that counts for something." The unfinished half of the sentence hung there in the air between them. It counts for something, since it has to count for everything you lack. Julian's younger sister Daphne played her part, with a smirk. She dressed up as affection. She called Marin the General. The General's got it all handled. Naturally, she'd announce, dropping her bag on the chair Marin had just cleared, never once carrying her own plate to the sink. The nickname was meant to flatter and to belittle in the same breath, to recast a decade of unthanked labor as a personality flaw, a fussiness, a need for control. Marin wasn't controlling. Marin was load-bearing. Nobody in that family had ever felt the weight, because she'd never once let it drop on them. She raised it with Julian exactly once. She told him she felt erased by his family, shut out of decisions, treated like staff. He gave her the look she'd cataloged years earlier, the look of a man being handed a problem he had no intention of solving. "That's just how they are, Mare. You're reading into it." She never raised it again. She filed it with the rest, and the file got heavier, and the heaviness got mistaken for calm. She'd been in Phoenix for 9 days. a leadership intensive for the hospitality group. The kind of thing she went to partly for work, and partly for the strange guilty pleasure of being somewhere no one needed her to be anything. The children were with her mother for the week, her own mother, who lived an hour out and adored having them, who fed them too much sugar and let them stay up too late and returned them happy. Julian had told her, the day before she left, that he'd come pick her up himself when she landed. Don't even think about a car. I'll be there. Hazel's been crossing days off the calendar. Her flight got in 11 minutes early. She texted him from the jet bridge. Nothing. She called from the train to baggage. Voicemail. She called again standing under the arrival sign, and he answered on the 6th ring, breathless, a clatter of metal behind him. Babe, I'm so sorry. The cooler died at Brentwood right in the middle of the rush. It's a nightmare. I've got 80 covers and no walk-in. Grab a car, okay? I'll make it up to you tonight, I swear. The voice was warm and smooth and rehearsed. It was not the voice of a man in a crisis. It was the voice of a man reading a line he'd written earlier and liked. Maren stood with her hand on the rail of her navy suitcase, and she listened, not to the words, to everything underneath them. No hiss of a busted compressor, no shouting line cooks. She heard the wide, soft hum of a large public room, and behind it, faint and unmistakable, the 3-note chime of a boarding announcement. He was at the airport. She was at the airport. Okay, she said. Don't worry about it. She hung up. She did not take the curb to the rideshare lot. She took the escalator up to the elevated walkway, the long glass corridor that crossed above the departures hall, and she was halfway across when she looked down through the wall of glass and saw him. Julian Voss, in the slate blue jacket, no apron, no flower, hair freshly cut, standing at the first-class counter with his hand on the small of a woman's back. The woman was younger, sleek, laughing in a yellow dress, a cream suitcase rolling onto the belt. Behind them, Glenda, sunglasses on, sorting boarding passes. Beside Glenda, Daphne, lifting her phone to capture the moment. And in front of Daphne, the 2 small children in matching stripes. Daphne's kids, not Maren's. Maren's children were an hour outside the city eating their grandmother's pancakes. These were the nieces, going somewhere warm, with their uncle, with the woman in yellow, with the whole tidy Voss family, on a vacation that had a place for everyone, except the woman who paid for the air they breathed. She stood at the glass for 5 minutes. She watched Julian lean down and kiss the woman in yellow on the mouth, slow and familiar. She watched him say something to his mother that made Glenda laugh, the open, relaxed laugh Maren had never once received in 9 years. She watched Daphne pull everyone into a photo. She did not cry. She did not shake. Something turned over behind her eyes that was neither grief nor fury. Something older and far more patient than either. It was the particular thing that happens when a woman who has spent years folding herself smaller suddenly remembers, all at once, the exact dimensions of who she actually is. She lifted her phone. She did not take a picture. She dialed a number she hadn't called in years, and a man answered on the 2nd ring. Harlan, she said. It's Maren. I need you to wake up the discretionary fund, full authority, and I need the real estate group in a room Monday morning. Harlan Pruitt had been principal counsel to the Sinclair Family Trust for 26 years. He did not ask why. He never asked why. Of course, Maren, he said. Welcome home. Julian came home 6 days later, sun-browned and loose and smelling of coconut, carrying the soft arrogance of a man certain his lie had held. He came into the kitchen at 8:30. The kids were asleep upstairs. Maren was at the table with a cup of tea and a manila folder, and she had been waiting the way a chess player waits. Not anxiously, just attentively, for an opponent to make the move she'd seen coming 8 turns out. There she is. He pulled a beer from the fridge and leaned against the counter. How was Phoenix? Educational, she said. How was the cooler? Brutal. Lost half the inventory. We were closed 2 days. He took a long drink. I'm wrecked. Which days were you closed? The bottle paused on its way back up. What? Which days? You always tell me. You file the closure with the insurer. You tell me the dates. A silence. 1 beat, then a 2nd beat. 1 beat too long. I'd have to check. Tuesday, I think. Maybe Wednesday. She set down her tea. She opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet. A passenger manifest. The kind of thing a woman with a $500 million trust and a firm of lawyers can have on her table by Monday afternoon. Voss Julian. Seat 2A, Cabo San Lucas, and the seat beside him 2B, Langford, Brielle. She turned it to face him. His expression traveled the whole distance, confusion to recognition to fear, in under 3 seconds. I was on the walkway above the departures hall, Maren said, and her voice was level, even, the trained calm of a woman who had spent 9 years managing her own tone and was now turning that skill to a different use entirely. I watched you check in. I watched you hand over 2 passports. I watched your mother behind you, counting boarding passes. I watched Daphne taking pictures. I watched you kiss her at the counter, in the jacket I had made for you. The kitchen was very quiet. The ice maker dropped a load of cubes and they both flinched. Marin, I can explain. No, she said. You can't. But I can. She drew a second sheet from the folder, then a third. Credit card statements with lines highlighted. Dinners for 2, at restaurants she'd never been to. A boutique hotel 3 blocks from his flagship on a night. He'd told her he was at a vendor dinner in Atlanta. A jewelry purchase, $1,100, dated 2 weeks before her last birthday. A birthday on which he'd given her a card and a kiss, and a story about a delayed shipment. She laid them down one at a time, and Julian watched the walls of his own house come apart and understood, for the first time, that he had never learned how walls were built. This goes back at least 19 months, she said. The money tells the whole story. You were never careful, Julian. You never had to be. You married a woman who was careful enough for both of you, and you mistook that for luck. His hands had started to shake. It was a mistake. A stupid. 19 months isn't a mistake. 19 months is a second life. You built one, and I funded it, and I didn't even know I was paying for it. She closed the folder and pressed her palms flat to the table, and she looked up at him. And for the first time in 9 years, she let him see her without the disguise. Not the patient wife, not the general, not the woman who absorbed and adjusted and smiled through her own slow erasure. She let him look at the one underneath, the one who had been running the numbers since the moment she stood at that glass wall, the one whose silence had never once been weakness. I want a divorce, she said. The filing goes in Monday. You can take the guest room until it does. After that, you'll find somewhere else. We have 2 kids, Marin. We can fix this. We have 2 kids. That's the only reason this is happening at a kitchen table and not through lawyers. She stood and picked up the folder. Sleep down here tonight, Mayor. His voice cracked, reaching for the register that had always worked. I'll end it. Tonight. I'll call her right now, I swear. She stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around. Here's the one thing you should know before you start planning your next move, she said. I'm not who you think I am. I never have been. She climbed the stairs. She closed the bedroom door. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed slow, eyes shut, for 30 seconds. Then she opened her laptop and sent 3 emails. One to Harlan, one to a real estate group she hadn't used in years, one to herself, a single line, a date, and a number. The game had begun, and the man downstairs didn't even know there was a board. The filing hit Julian like a freight train he'd never thought to check the tracks for. But the filing was only the surface, the part that showed. Underneath it, Marin Sinclair was doing what Sinclairs do when the situation calls for it. She was restructuring. The house came first. The down payment, years back, had come quietly from her own separate account, and she had, of course she had, kept the documentation. Her lawyers filed a motion establishing her disproportionate contribution, and it landed on Julian's attorney's desk like a brick through a window. But that was the small move. The real ones were quieter. Julian's restaurant group had been chasing a single deal for 2 years, a build-out on a downtown corner that was meant to be his flagship, his crown, the place that would finally turn the brand from cash-hungry expansion into something that owned its own walls. The whole thing hinged on acquiring the corner property, which was leased and operated through a holding company, which was owned, in turn, by a trust. The trust was the Sinclair Trust. The property was Marin's. It had sat in the family portfolio for 14 years. She didn't block the sale. She didn't sabotage it. She simply went silent. The emails from his group's broker went unanswered. The calls rolled to voicemail. The deal, which had momentum, lost it, then began to coast backward. His investors got restless. His partners started asking why the parcel that had seemed locked was suddenly a black hole. Julian poured weeks into rescuing it, never once suspecting that the immovable obstacle was his own wife, 6 miles away in a sunlit apartment, reading his group's offers over coffee on a balcony lined with potted herbs and choosing, every morning, not to reply. The second move she let the world see. Through the Sinclair Foundation, a philanthropic arm she'd kept dormant for the whole of her marriage. She made a gift to the Culinary Institute downtown, the one that trained half the line cooks in the city, including, years ago, a young Julian Voss. The gift funded a new teaching wing. It came with a naming right, the Sinclair Center for Culinary Arts. Her name, carved into stone, on the building where the man who dismissed her for 9 years had learned his trade. It wasn't revenge. It was visibility. After 9 years of being the most invisible person in every room Julian occupied, her name was now cut into the front of one. His world began, very gently, to ask questions. A food writer mentioned the gift in a profile of the Institute. A colleague asked him, half joking, "Sinclair, like the shipping Sinclairs, any relation to your wife?" And Julian had no answer, because Julian had never asked. He had been married for 9 years to the heir of one of the largest fortunes in the state, and he had never once thought to wonder why a woman who supposedly cleared $60,000 a year had never, not once, seemed truly afraid of money. The collapse, when it came fast, and it came in the most ordinary possible ways. Without Marin, the house simply stopped working. The internet went dark because the account was in her name, and the card on file had been hers. A mortgage payment bounced because he didn't know the login. The lawn went feral. Theo's dentist appointment passed unattended. The dog, Pepper, a soft brown mutt Julian had brought home on a whim, and Moran had fed and walked and medicated for 6 years, went a week past her flea treatment and got sick on the rug. The property tax notice came and sat unopened in a pile of mail that grew like sediment on the counter. He called Marin 11 times the first month, for passwords, for account numbers, for the name of the pest control company, for the Wi-Fi, for the pediatrician, for the plumber. She answered each question once, clearly without warmth, the way you'd read instructions aloud to a stranger assembling furniture for the first time. Then she stopped answering at all. Glenda came to help. She lasted 9 days, and in those 9 days, the woman who had spent nearly a decade implying that her daughter-in-law contributed nothing discovered the actual scope of what Marin had been carrying. The schedules, the systems, the silent maintenance of 2 children, and a household and a failing restaurant empire, all at once. Daphne later said her mother had called her in a voice she'd never heard before. She was running everything, Daphne. Everything. I had no idea. She was always kind of a control freak, Mom. No. A long pause on the line. She was the only one of us who ever did a single thing, and we treated her like the help. It was the truest thing Glenda Voss had said about Marin in 9 years. It came too late, and she said it to the wrong person, and it changed nothing at all. Brielle Langford lasted 3 months. She had fallen for a version of Julian Voss that didn't exist. The celebrity chef with the smooth, managed life, the clean house, the easy money, the charm that never seemed to cost him anything. When the real one surfaced, the man who couldn't find the water shut-off, who let the mail pile up, who forgot the parent-teacher conference, who sat at midnight surrounded by overdue notices, he didn't understand. Brielle looked at the wreckage and saw the truth she should have seen at the start. She hadn't fallen in love with a man. She'd fallen in love with another woman's engineering, and the engineer had walked out, and the machine was grinding to a halt. She left on a Sunday with her cream suitcase and her expensive shampoo, and did not look back. Julian sat on the couch that night, with a glass of bourbon and a stack of unpaid bills, and arrived dimly and far too late, at the realization that the woman he'd written off as controlling had been the only reason his life had ever held its shape. Marin bought a row house in the historic district 3 weeks after the filing. Not a rental, a purchase, in cash, through the trust. The first time in 9 years, she had openly spent her own money to build something that was only hers. Tall windows, a walled garden, a flat roof. She turned into a terrace with a long view over the river. Hazel claimed the bedroom with the window seat. Theo claimed the garden, which he declared was the sovereign territory of himself and Pepper and no one else. And the dog seemed to agree, sprawling in the one patch of afternoon sun, like she'd been waiting her whole life for it. Marin went back to work. Not to the hospitality group, but to the foundation, into the seat she'd been born to, and had spent a decade pretending she didn't have. She joined the board. She took over a portfolio of grants in housing and women's shelters and adult education, and she used the same operational mind that had run an invisible household to run a charitable enterprise with an 8-figure annual budget. And she was, to no one's surprise but the world's, very good at it. The story surfaced in pieces. A business magazine ran a profile that called her a returning figure in regional philanthropy, gave her divorce a single line, and gave her work 4 pages. The photograph showed her on the roof of the row house with the river behind her, in a plain charcoal dress, her posture straight, her face calm, her eyes carrying the particular clarity of a woman who has stopped shrinking. Julian read it on his phone. In the kitchen of the house he could no longer afford to keep, surrounded by dishes he hadn't washed. He read it twice. He didn't recognize the setting or the dress, but that wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him was the scale of it. The foundation, the trust, the fortune, the name carved into the institute where he'd learned to cook. He had been married to one of the wealthiest women in the state and never known, because he had never once looked up from the mirror long enough to see who was holding it. The call came on a Sunday in late autumn. Marin was on her terrace, a blanket over her knees, the city laid out below her like a lit circuit board. Hazel and Theo were asleep. Pepper was a warm weight against her foot. The phone buzzed, and she let it ring 4 times before she answered. Marin. Julian's voice had changed. The confidence was gone, the performance stripped away, and what was left was the bare, lost sound of a man standing in the rubble of a life he never learned to build. I need to see you, not through the lawyers. In person. Please. There's nothing to do in person. I know about the trust. I know about the foundation. I know who your family is. She looked at the river. You know now, she said. You didn't know for 9 years because you never asked. You never asked about my family. You never asked how the restaurant stayed open, or how the mortgage got paid, or why a woman earning $60,000 a year never once panicked about money. You never asked because you weren't curious about me. You were comfortable with what I provided. That's not fair. It's exactly fair. You had 9 years to wonder about your own life. You spent them calling me controlling while you lived inside the order I built. You let your mother shut me out, and your sister mock me, and another woman into our bed. And now you're calling because you searched my last name and found a number attached to it. Silence on the line. Then, smaller. My mother wants to apologize. Your mother wants access. Those aren't the same thing. She spent 9 years treating me like staff. She doesn't get to renegotiate now that she's seen the balance sheet. Daphne wanted to know if you'd connect her with some of your foundation people. She's thinking about starting a nonprofit. Marin almost smiled, the kind of smile that never reaches the mouth, that lives entirely behind the eyes. Daphne, who'd called her the general for a decade, who'd dropped her bag on cleared chairs and eaten meals she never offered to clean up from, now wanted professional favors from the woman she'd belittled. Tell Daphne the foundation's application is on the website. She's welcome to apply through the same process as everyone else. Marin, please, I'm losing everything. The downtown deal fell apart. My partners pulled out. I can't close without that corner, and the holding company won't return a single call. She set her cup down on the table and let the silence stretch because she wanted him to sit inside it. The holding company won't return your calls, Julian, because the holding company is me. The quiet that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. That corner has been in my family's portfolio for 14 years. You've spent 2 years trying to buy a building from your own wife, and you never knew, because in 9 years of marriage, you never asked me one real question about who I am. She heard his breath go shallow and uneven. I'm not going to sell it to you. I'm not going to block it forever either. When the time's right, I'll sell it at fair market value to a buyer who qualifies. If your group can restructure and meet the terms, you're free to bid. But you won't get a discount, and you won't get special treatment, and you won't get a phone call. She paused, and when she went on, her voice didn't rise. It carried across the cold night air with the whole weight of 9 years behind it. You called me the general behind my back. You called me controlling to your mother. You called me sensitive when I asked to be let in. You treated me like the floor, and you never once looked down to see who was holding it up. I hid what I had because I wanted to be loved for myself. What I found out is that I wasn't loved at all. That's the answer to the question you never thought to ask. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the table. She picked up her cup and drank, slowly, looking out over a city she had quietly owned pieces of, since before she'd ever met him. The city he'd tried to build a name in without ever once realizing he was building it on her ground. A year to the day after the airport, on a cold December night, Marin sat on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket she'd bought herself the week she moved in. It was the first expensive thing she'd purchased openly, without apology, without clipping anything, and she had felt no guilt at all. She opened her phone and found the folder she'd made that first night. Not photographs, documents. The statements, the hotel charge, the manifest, the jewelry receipt. The whole careful structure of evidence she'd built with the same precision she brought to everything. She looked at it for a long while. It had done its work. The divorce was final. Custody was settled, the children safe and rooted, and watching every day what it looked like when a woman built a life with her own 2 hands and her own name on the door. The corner downtown was under contract to a qualified buyer who was not Julian. The foundation was thriving. She selected the folder. She pressed delete. The phone asked if she was sure. She was. The screen returned her to recent photos. Hazel mid-law on the garden swing. Theo painted to the elbows, grinning like a thief. Pepper asleep in the long bar of afternoon light across the floorboards. The terrace at dusk. The stone front of the Culinary Institute. Sinclair catching the morning sun. She held the phone a moment longer, then set it down. She thought about the glass corridor. Not the betrayal, but the moment itself, standing high above the departures hall, with her husband's whole life arranged beneath her like a blueprint. And how, instead of breaking, instead of pounding on the glass, instead of becoming the small, shattered thing they all expected, she had simply lifted the phone and called Harlan. She had not chosen revenge. She had chosen recognition, the plain, late recognition that the woman she'd been pretending to be was so much smaller than the woman she actually was, and that the pretending had never protected her at all. It had only made her invisible to the very people she'd been trying to love. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her name was on a building. Her foundation funded shelters for women who had been made to feel small by people who needed them to stay that way. Her children slept upstairs in a house she owned outright. Her dog breathed slow against her foot. The rosemary on the railing stirred in the December wind, and somewhere over the dark river a plane crossed, its lights blinking, carrying somewhere warm a cabin full of people who might or might not be lying to someone waiting at home. Maren Sinclair watched it go. She pulled the blanket tighter and breathed in the cold and the herbs and the deep, clean quiet of a woman who no longer needs to be anything other than exactly what she is. She had spent years testing whether love could survive without the gravity of her money, and what she'd learned was simpler and harder than she'd expected. That love without curiosity isn't love. It's appetite. They had all eaten at a table she'd set, and never once thanked the woman who built it. The builder was home now, under her own roof, under her own name. And when she finally stood and went inside to check on her sleeping children, she did not look back at the empty sky, because the view from where she was standing had become the better one.